Welcome to this video, which will walk you through Task 1 of the EdTPA using the Understanding the Rubric Level Progressions document for secondary English. If you don't have the document open, you may want to pause the video, go to the EdTPA support site, click on Secondary English, and on the page that opens up, right under the handbooks, you'll see Understanding the Rubrics. You may want to click on that link and open it. As you scroll down through the document, the first thing you're going to see are scoring guidelines. Scorers look for a pattern of evidence, meaning that if most of the evidence that's being looked at for a specific rubric falls at one score point, but a little bit falls at another, they look to see where most of the evidence falls, and that's the score that's assigned. Some rubrics have multiple criteria. So if there is a criterion labeled as primary, and again, if there's a discrepancy in the scores between that and other elements of the response, the part addressing the primary criterion is where the score is going to come from. Some rubrics also have an automatic 1. If your response fits the description of the automatic 1, it doesn't matter what else you have in there. The scorer has no choice but to assign the 1. The EdTPA for secondary English is designed around your instruction that is designed to support students to construct meaning from, interpret, or respond to complex text. In order to create lessons that allow students to develop these abilities, it's important to understand what complex text is. So according to Common Core, there are 3 dimensions of complex text. The first is the qualitative, which means the purpose, the structure, the language convention, the prior knowledge, background information that students need to know to deal with a text. The quantitative dimensions are the word length, the frequency, the sentence length, the text cohesion. These are things that are going to impact the reading level of the text. And the third element is how the reader interacts with those task dimensions. And those elements include things like motivation, prior knowledge, the purpose of the task. And so those are variable. They're going to change according to each reader. It's also important to understand what textual references are. You're going to need to have students using textual references. You're going to need to use them. And so it means specific mention of examples from the text that direct student attention, but it's not simply a direct quote. It's not simply a paraphrase. If you have a novel that has lots of references in it. For example, the novel Gentle Hands by M.E. Kerr has lots of allusions to operas, to events, to scenes, to images, to characters. So you need to make sure that students are aware of those and focused on those. So these are all text references. Generic references, so if you just kind of refer to the text as a whole, that's not considered a textual reference in terms of EdTPA. So let's look at the rubrics now for Task 1. Rubric 1 is related to planning, and the overarching question here is, how do your plans build on each other to help students build their abilities to use those text references to construct meaning, interpret, or respond to complex text? You'll notice there's an automatic 1. If your content is not accurate in terms of the central focus or your objectives, that's automatically a 1. If your standards and objectives do not align to the materials or the tasks that you're having students do, that's an automatic 1. So for example, if my standard and my objective are related to students supporting their interpretation of a text using text references from multiple texts, okay, but the activities that I have them doing are answering who, what, where, when, and what, and how questions. I'm not really having them do an activity that's going to help them develop the skills in the objective. That's misalignment. That's an automatic 1. So you'll notice the next thing is that we go immediately to level 3. Level 3, according to Pearson, is the minimum score that you need to be considered proficient in a rubric. And so they teach their scorers to look for the level 3. If you don't have the level 3, then you look and see how much is missing and compare it to a 2 or a 1. If you have everything in the 3 and there's still more, then you compare it to the descriptions for 4 and 5 and see if there's enough to move it up. So let's look at the 3. The plans are logically sequenced. So each plan builds on the next one. It doesn't necessarily have to be a linear sequence if students are using their skills to interpret or respond to text by reasoning from what they already know. So if you're working that way, that can work. The way the plans are sequenced, though, supports the students. And there's evidence that your students are the ones making connections between interpretation and responding to the text, supported with textual references. These connections that students are going to make are not left to chance, so they're clearly written in the plans and in the commentary, and you're explaining how students are going to do that. Please be careful to pay attention to text references and either constructing meaning, interpreting, or responding to text within your lessons. So that's what you need to get to that proficient score. Below the proficient score, okay, if the focus is on literal comprehension of text and there's very little, if any, attention paid to constructing meaning, interpreting, or responding, the connections to constructing meaning or interpreting complex text are vague. It's not clear how students are making those connections. And we talked about the automatic 1 when there are content inaccuracies and misalignment. To get to an advanced score, and I really recommend that you focus on advanced scores, it will give you the best chance of having a successful EdTPA. So at this level, beyond the 3, the tasks that you're using support the students so they are making clear connections, not just once, but throughout your learning segment among the textual references and constructing meaning, interpreting, or responding to a text in every lesson. The connections that students are making require them to use their understanding of the complex text to explain their reasoning or their strategies, and they do that using textual references. These connections deepen the student's understanding of your central focus. Moving on to Rubric 2. Rubric 2 and 3 are confusing because they both refer you to prompts 2 and 3. In prompt 2, you are writing about all these things you know about your students, their prior learning, their experiences, their interests, their commonalities based on the community, things like that. But it's really in prompt 3 where the 2 rubrics are scored. This is where you are now explaining how you used all that information that you know to make the decisions for your lessons. So here, rubric 2 is focusing on planned supports. And planned supports are strategies, tasks, and materials that you choose deliberately to help your students get to your central focus. So the question is, how do you use what you know about your students to make these decisions? And you'll see again, there's an automatic 1. So the automatic 1 comes about if you have students with IEPs and 504s and you do not address the modifications for those students. If the modifications for those students do not apply, for example, if you have a student with an IEP and the only modifications are for math, perhaps using a calculator or having fewer problems on a page, well, you're not teaching math, but in the commentary, I would note that the accommodations are specifically for math and do not apply in this learning segment. That way, it's clear that you've considered that student's needs. For this rubric at the level 3, you have explained clearly how the supports that you are using, the strategies, the tasks, the materials, Why are they appropriate for your class? How do they meet the needs of your class for what you're teaching? And the other connection is, how do the supports help them master that central focus and the objectives? So you've addressed the connections for the supports, and you've addressed any individual modifications. It's not enough for the IEPs and 504s to just list them in the context for learning. You've got to talk about them in the planning task and the commentary. At the emerging level, you don't really have any supports. Or you have supports, but it's not clear how the supports help the students reach the objectives. And that automatic 1 if you don't address any IEP or 504 modifications. At the advanced level, your supports address specific needs beyond the students with the IEPs and 504 plans. So perhaps you're differentiating your supports for students who are gifted or students who are struggling readers or below grade level, whatever it is that's in your group. So scaffolding, structured supports. When you differentiate them, you need to describe how the support meets the student's needs and how it helps them get to the objective. And at that level 5, the highest level, you've identified misconceptions that students have related to what you're teaching and proactively plans how to address those. Rubric 3 is scored from the other half of prompt 3, and this is using what do you know about your students' prior learning? What do students already know? What have they learned that they can build on to get to your objectives? So how do you plan learning tasks and choose materials based on what you know? And you may also make connections to students' their interests, their traditions, their culture, their backgrounds, their community experiences, any of that you can connect to and build on. So you'll notice there are multiple criteria here. Criterion 1 is this, so this is the one that counts more, is that you have a clear justification of your plans based on either prior learning or those personal, cultural, and community assets. Second criterion, you connect it to research or theory. What have you learned in your courses that makes you think these are good options? You'll notice there's also an automatic 1, and the automatic 1 is a deficit view. So this represents anything where you look at your students and you say, because of the struggles they face outside of school, or the lack of family support, or their cultural background, or the fact that English is not their first language, that it's kind of like you are expressing a view that the student's not going to be able to learn. What you want to do is focus on the strengths that the student has and explain how, even though the student has this challenge, you're going to build on it. If you're kind of using it as the student's not going to learn anyway, and setting a low expectation, that's the deficit view, and that scores the automatic 1. At a proficient level, the tasks are clearly connected to prior learning or student assets, and you've got those connections to research or theory. Below that 3, the connections are vague, or you have something that represents a deficit view. At the advanced level, you clearly explain how prior learning and a personal, cultural, or community asset helps to support students in learning what you're teaching. There are specific examples connecting those elements to new learning tasks. And you explain how the research or theory led you to choosing the tasks, or how you implemented the tasks in your lessons. Rubric 4 deals with academic language, and this is a tough one to kind of wrap our heads around because there are so many key concepts to it. So basically, your students have language demands, which just mean the different ways that they need to use language to develop and demonstrate their understanding. You're going to be asked to identify a language function, which is a purpose, only one, that students have for using language in your learning tasks. It is represented by an action verb. such as identifying, explaining, describing, predicting. Okay, something that generally applies across your lessons. In order to use that language function, students have related demands. They need to know specific vocabulary. So subject-specific terms that are important for them to be able to either understand or use. Discourse, speaking and writing about their understanding and what they're learning. Syntax, how words are organized to create sentences. How does that impact what they're doing? And each language demand that you discuss, you need to have a concrete support for that language demand. So at level 3, you've identified the demands and you have supports for the whole class for using the language function, vocabulary, and or syntax or discourse. So these are examples. With younger children might be pictures of vocabulary. Models that you give students. If I'm writing an argumentative essay and my students are working from a model, that can be an example of supporting discourse or using vocabulary. At the emerging level, the supports are misaligned, meaning they don't really support what they claim to support. Or you've only provided supports for one demand. Maybe you only provided supports for vocabulary. At a level 1, there is a superficial view of what academic language is. It's just very at the surface and doesn't dig into the different demands. At the advanced level, you have supports for multiple demands. So you have supports for your function, whether it's explaining, identifying, justifying, whatever it is, vocabulary, and syntax or discourse. So you've got supports for 3 different demands, and the supports occur within specific learning tasks. So you're explaining how the support helps the student use the language demand within that task. The supports are differentiated. You don't use the same support for everything. Examples, sentence starters, graphic organizers, vocabulary maps, models, think alouds. Lots of different potential options here. And our final rubric, rubric 5, is justifying your assessments. So the question is, how do your assessments measure students' progress? And so they need to be monitoring constructing meaning from, interpreting, or responding to complex texts. But notice the other piece here, to build a written product. So your students need to make a reading-writing connection within the lessons. Your assessments, both formal and informal, are designed to give you feedback about what students can do, what students are struggling with, and it helps you adjust your teaching and ultimately student learning. The only automatic one here is, again, if you have students with IEPs or 504 plans and you don't discuss their modifications. So at the level 3, the proficient level, you have explained clearly how each of your methods of assessment will give you evidence. What are students doing and what evidence is it going to give you that they are constructing meaning from, interpreting, or responding to text? And this happens not just once, but at multiple points throughout your lessons. And it focuses on developing a written product, and it addresses all of those IEP and 504 modifications. So that's what you need to reach proficient. At the emerging level, you have insufficient evidence of constructing meaning, interpreting, or responding to text to build a written product. Or you use the same type of assessment in every lesson, and that automatic one when there are no adaptations that are required. So insufficient evidence. My students are completing an exit ticket, and it will tell me if they can construct meaning from the text. Okay, that's insufficient. What are students going to do, and how is what they are doing going to tell me they're constructing meaning? I need to kind of justify what I'm doing in those assessments. At the advanced level, I've got multiple forms of assessments, including a written product, and the evidence that I get from all of those assessments will be consistent. I will be able at any point to track for each student. Is the student mastering this objective? Is the student making progress? Where are they? If they're making progress but they haven't gotten there, where are they in that progress? The evidence is collected at different times, and at the most advanced level, the assessments can be differentiated. So they're targeted to different student needs. And that may be something like if I'm teaching argumentative writing, rather than having every student create an argumentative essay on the same topic, I may give them a choice of topics. That will differentiate according to their interest. So a lot of information in a very short time. If you do have any questions that have not been answered, please feel free to email us at teachersuccess@wgu.edu and look for part 2 and part 3 soon.